stand. Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel of the Lord.
Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents an inspiring gospel reflection by Father Michael Sparrow. Father Michael is a Jesuit priest working as a writer and retreat master at the Bellarmine Jesuit Retreat House outside Chicago.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. At that time, Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, went up the mountain and sat down there. Great crowds came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the deformed, the mute, and many others. They placed them at Jesus' feet, and he cured them all. The crowds were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the deformed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind able to see. And they glorified the God of Israel. Jesus summoned his disciples and said, "My heart is moved with pity for the crowd, for they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry for fear they may collapse on the way." The disciples said to him, "Where could we ever get enough bread in the deserted place to satisfy such a crowd?" Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" They answered, 7, and a few fish. He ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, gave thanks, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied. The fragments they picked up that were left over, 7 baskets full. The Gospel of the Lord. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, the Lord will never be outdone in generosity. It's one of my favorite sayings about the Lord, and I quote it often. When we are generous to the Lord, you can rest assured that he's going to be more than generous to us. Not only in return, but taking the first step toward that generosity. It's his love for us first. It's his generosity to us that inspires a return of love. And we see that played out in spades in our first reading and gospel today. Our first reading that Clem read for us from the prophet Isaiah 25 says, "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will provide for all people a feast of rich food and choice wine." In our gospel today from Matthew chapter 15, Jesus goes up on the mountain. The crowds are there, and they bring to Jesus all these people who are sick, and he heals them. And the response on the part of the people is amazement. In fact, they're not just there for a few hours, they're there traveling with Jesus for 3 days. It's like they've come to the Bellarmine Retreat House and made a weekend retreat. And Jesus' heart is filled with compassion for them as he realizes their human need and they're hungry. And there's this dilemma, of course, that we're very familiar with. These 4,000 people who are fed with a few loaves, 7 loaves, and a few fish. In fact, there are 7 baskets full. They feast until they're full, and then there's plenty left over. There's this clear pairing between the prophecy in Isaiah and the fulfillment of that prophecy of Jesus physically healing, nourishing their hearts satisfying their bellies. A little detail that I call your attention to is Jesus takes the loaves and he blesses them and breaks them, but then in turn he gives them to the disciples to distribute to the crowds. And I think that's the call for each one of us. As we meditate in the midst of this most wonderful time of the year, we have to work not to be caught up in simply the commercialization of the season or our own little rituals that we have for Christmas, and I've got as many of those rituals probably as you, but to not make the season about doing all of these wonderful little things that can sometimes kill the joy. That Jesus gives the loaves to the people, and then to his disciples, and they in turn distribute them. Come to the Lord. Spend time with the Lord this Advent season. It's wonderful that we're gathered together here for Eucharist, but we need to enter into deep contemplation, even if it's 15 minutes a day, spending some time with the Lord to allow him to take the loaves, to bless them, and then give them to us as we then in turn distribute them to the people. If we don't spend that time with the Lord in this season, then our gift giving and our cookie baking and our feasting and our merrymaking and our going from one event to the other will drain us and leave us empty and resentful, waiting for December 26th to just get the whole darn thing over with. But if this season of Advent is about going up the mountain and listening to Jesus in the quiet solitude of our hearts, allowing him to give us that bread, then we in turn have something to give to others. If not, we're just caught up in the commercialization of the season. The choice is ours. Amen.
Heart